A national budget isn't just a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a story. It's a story about a country's priorities and its future. But according to our source material, India's budget 2026 is telling two very different stories. One is this grand vision of a high-tech transformed nation. The other, well, that one's kind of hidden in the fine print. So let's dig in. Okay, so first up, let's talk about the story that made all the headlines. This is the version of the budget that's packed with these huge, ambitious, and really transformative announcements. Right off the bat, they announced a major push into high-tech manufacturing with something called a second phase semiconductor mission. And that was followed by a massive infrastructure promise. We're talking about 7 new high-speed rail corridors designed to connect the nation's most important economic hubs. This vision of a super modern India didn't stop there. It also moved into education, with the announcement of 5 brand new university townships to be built near major industrial centers. And for industry, the budget promised new mega textile parks and other programs to give a real boost to a critical sector. You put it all together and it paints a really powerful and ambitious picture, right? An India transformed. That's the promise. But our source for this explainer urges us to look beyond those shiny headlines and dig into the actual numbers. And that's where the second story starts to come into focus. So, you have to ask, who's paying for all these big promises? Let's zoom right in on the middle-class taxpayer and see what this budget really meant for their wallets. Now, the big expectation for a lot of people was pretty clear. Some kind of tax cut, right? Something to provide a little relief and maybe boost spending. The reality? No change. The income tax slabs and rates stayed exactly the same. In fact, for some folks, the tax burden actually went up. Specifically, the Security Transaction Tax, or STT, on trading futures and options was hiked. For futures trading, the tax more than doubled, and for options, it jumped up pretty significantly too. This is a direct hit to the pockets of individual stock market investors. And to put that into perspective, our source material notes that with this change, and I'm quoting here, so today the government of India is earning more than the broker. Wow, that really highlights just how significant this new cost is for everyday traders. Okay, so if there's no tax relief for the individual, let's zoom out a bit. Where is the government's money actually coming from and where is it all going? When you look at where the government's revenue comes from, the single biggest piece of the pie is borrowing. But right after that, you've got income tax and GST. Now get this, when you combine those two, the taxes paid by individuals, they make up 36% of the revenue. That's literally double the 18% that comes from corporate taxes. And according to the source, this isn't just a coincidence, it's a trend. There's been a clear shift over the years. It used to be that corporations contributed a much larger share of the tax revenue, but more and more, that burden has been moving onto the shoulders of individual taxpayers. And this brings us right to the core of the issue. Let's take a look at some of those key sectors and compare the grand announcements we heard about with the actual money that was allocated in the budget. Let's start with education. The promises were incredible. Those new university townships, creator labs in thousands of schools, upgraded telescope facilities. It really painted a picture of a forward-thinking, modern education system. But the numbers tell a different story. For over 60 years, various commissions have recommended that India spend 6% of its GDP on education. The actual allocation in this budget? It's still stuck below 3%. That is a huge gap between the ambition and the financial commitment. And it's a pretty similar story in healthcare. The announcements painted a really positive picture of progress. Upgrading institutions, training 150,000 new caregivers, and even creating hubs for medical tourism. And here again, we see that familiar pattern in the numbers. While the World Health Organization recommends spending about 5% of GDP on health, India's allocation is still hovering around 2%. You see the disconnect, right? The promises are ambitious, but the funding just doesn't seem to follow. Now for our cities, we heard about those 7 high-speed rail corridors and this new concept of city economic regions, which all suggested a big push to empower our urban areas. And then you see probably the most shocking number of all. The budget for urban development, the actual money for things like water, sewage, and public transport, was cut. Not just a little bit, but by almost 12% compared to the previous year. That's a direct contradiction to the whole narrative of empowering cities. So, how does this budget plan to tackle huge global shifts like artificial intelligence and trade? Well, the government made a specific policy choice here that our source finds particularly concerning. The key policy is a massive, 2-decade-long tax holiday. It's designed to attract foreign companies to come and build large-scale AI data centers in India. The goal, of course, is to make India a major hub for the next wave of technology. But our source highlights the hidden costs. These data centers are incredibly thirsty. They consume enormous amounts of energy and water. They also carry serious risks of pollution. So, in a country that's already facing resource scarcity, inviting this kind of industry in with huge tax breaks, it definitely raises some serious questions. And this presents a really critical trade-off. It's a huge financial benefit for these foreign companies, for sure, but what's the potential environmental and social cost for the people who actually live there? That's the big question at the heart of this policy. So, when you step back and look at everything we've covered, from the taxes to education to this AI policy, the source material argues that a clear, repeating pattern starts to emerge from all the noise. And that pattern is a cycle. It starts with these grand, flashy announcements and ambitious schemes that capture everyone's imagination. But these are followed by underwhelming financial allocations that, well, they just can't possibly match the scale of the promise. And the result? Those critical gaps in health, education, and infrastructure, they just remain. And this brings us right back to where we started. On the one hand, we have the story told by exciting headlines, and on the other, the story told by the hard numbers in the fine print. So the final question is this: when a budget tells two completely different stories, which one truly defines the path forward?